May 5th, 1943, 02 and 8 hours, North Atlantic, 5th 60 grails un, 31W. The wind was force 8 and the sea ran in black hills under tatters of sleet. Night felt endless. A convoy ploughed west in 3 columns, mast lights hooded. Bows hurling green water and phosphorescent spray into the dark as merchant whistles moaned once and fell silent. Every sound mattered. On the lead escort's bridge, the red glow of a shaded lamp bathed an Huff-Duff console, the operator's hands steady on the tuning knob as the needle quivered over a narrow slice of high frequency. Listening became hunting. A spike rose clean in his headphones, sharp, metallic, unmistakable. An enemy contact report riding the 10-18 to Menace band toward BDU in occupied France. A whisper betrayed a wolf. HKFDF bearing green 25, strength 4. He called, voice flat in the wind, hammered space, and a yeoman wrote the words just as the destroyer's head swung to meet the angle. The ship answered like a fist. On another escort, 2 miles astern, the same call cut through a different roar. Huff-Duff, red tin, strength 3, and a thin pencil scratched a second line across a chart pinned under a mug and a divider's bite. Lines became a trap. On the U-boat's bridge, a capite lieutenant in a slick oilskin cupped his glove over a throat mic and spoke a Kerr signal with the practiced calm of a hunter. Sighted convoy, course and speed, will shadow. Confidence rode the air. His type thigh lay on the surface like a black shark fin between combers. Diesel exhaust torn away by gale gusts. Deck awash as men hunched behind the bridge combing and watched the horizon for muzzle flashes. Invisibility felt earned. He believed the night, the sea, and the range of the Atlantic were his far-flung cloak. He believed the shortness of his transmission made him a ghost. Belief was a shield. The Allied escorts had learned a different lesson, and the new high-frequency direction finding, Huff-Duff, made bearings from whispers in the storm, a loopless adcock array feeding a goniometer that steadied a needle in the roll. Technology made a compass. On the destroyer's mast, 4 vertical rods perched like a crown above the bridge, their calm geometry indifferent to the sea that shook everything else. The set did not blink. Second bearing confirms. Intersection here. The navigator said, tapping the chart where 2 pencil lines crossed in a small, cruel X. And the helm rang answers as the ship lunged down the angle with green water exploding over the forecastle. An idea turned into a course. BDU and UR Angriff in Rudel crackled the either far to the east as the control transmitted a wolfpack order and more shadows angled in the dark to close on the convoy's life. The net drew tight. The escort's Type 271 radar, 10 CRM, magnetron-borne, picked a small, jagged pip 4,000 yards off the new heading, a surface contact where nothing should have been. The sets brushed, metal hood shining wet under sleet. Electrons found shape. Contact 035, range decreasing, murmured the radar operator, and a signalman's frozen hands bent a star shell into the flare pistol, its cap luminous under his thumb even in the dark. Light weighted in brass. The U-boat commander heard, it first as a change in the sea's voice, a deeper thunder within the gale, and he turned to starboard to keep the wind on the bow and the spray off his men. Instinct answered. When the star shell climbed, it carried a soft white sun under a parachute, and in that milk, blue glare the night turned treacherous, a black conning tower painted on the sky like a target drawn by a child. Invisible became obvious. "Alarm! Tochen!" he barked, and the diving klaxon brayed into the sleet as men slid down the hatch, hands tearing at corded rail and wet steel, boots slamming rungs 2 at a time. Panic ran fast. Diesels cut and electric motors whined as ballast cramps blew and the bow dipped, but the escort had the angle and the range now, and the HFRDF plot that began as lines on paper felt like a hand on the U-boat's collar. A bearing became a grip. On the destroyer's bridge, water hammered glass, and a voice like a metronome cut through the storm. Standby depth charges, Hedgehog ready. Maintain course 3-5. As the helmsman fought the yaw, and the bow chewed into the trows. Purpose drowned doubt. From the after spaces the operator's cool cadence recorded it for the night order book. IO2T1. HEF-DF contact. Altered course to intercept. Radar contact obtained. Illuminating shell fired. Sound gear manned. History wrote itself in present tense. Far beneath the glare a black shape slid into green-black. Bow planes biting as the Atlantic closed over the conning tower, and the flare hissed downwind into sleet. Silence tried to return, but on the surface the escorts now had the measure of a tactic and a tool, and the radio that once stitched wolf packs together had drawn a straight line back to the hunter. The advantage turned inside out. In those seconds between a whisper and a white parachute of light, the Germans trusted their submarines were invisible. Huff-Duff led the Allies right to them. The Battle of the Atlantic began as a duel of endurance and distance. Convoys inching across grey water, while UA boats waited with diesels warm and binoculars wet, striking at night on the surface, where ASTIC could not see. Darkness felt like armour. Carl Du Nitz shaped the jagged into Rudel tactic, Wolfpack tactics, assigning patrol lines across probable convoy routes, so a single sighting could summon a dozen boats by radio to converge and attack in waves until ships flamed and broke. Coordination was a blade. The system demanded messages, contact reports, shadowing updates, attack orders, sent on high frequency bands that could leap the horizon by skywave to BDU in France and Germany, stitching the ocean into a command net. Radio made reach. U-boats trusted their invisibility, because the surface at night made them fast, low and hard to see, and because early Allied radar was long, wave and detectable by the Mitox receiver, a wooden box that hissed warning when aircraft searched from afar. Confidence road circuits. Convoys, for their part, were steel and routine. Commodore's lamp signals, zigzag plans pinned in wheelhouses, escort groups spread like a bristling hedge around freighters that smelled of diesel, wool, and grain. Vulnerability had a scent. Through 1940-42 the happy times proved the tactic's sting. Ships sank off Ireland in the mid-ocean gap, and with Operation Drumbeat even along America's lit-up coast where tankers burned against boardwalk lights. Hubris found fuel, but the Allies rebuilt the equation piece by piece. Escort carriers with Swordfish and Avengers, very long-range liberators with Temtool CMEV ASVMK, FE radar, Hedgehog ahead throwers, and a doctrine that sent support groups roving to reinforce convoys under attack. Pressure learned to move. Into that web came high-frequency direction finding, HFDF, Huff-Duff. Initially a shore network of white eye stations from Iceland to the Clyde to Newfoundland, and then, crucially, compact shipborne sets that took bearings in seconds from fleeting U-boat signals. Listening became a weapon. The RN's FH.4 set, with its vertical adcock aerials and goniometer stripped out skywave confusion, and steadied a needle even as a destroyer rolled, producing a bearing good enough to steer by while the message was still on the air. Speed made precision matter. 2 escorts in company could cross, bear those lines on a chart, and get a fix within miles, and a shore station's bearing could add a third line that narrowed the X to a place where star shells and Hun-by-Sea-Undenrism radar could find shape in spray. Geometry became a trap. Dionitz understood the danger and tightened radio discipline. Kurzsignal, ultra-short signal groups, pre-arranged shadowing codes, and pushed for devices like courier to compress transmissions into fractions of a second. He fought time. Yet necessity forced talk. A pack without a shepherd wasted fuel and darkness, and a lone boat without a net could not crack a well, led convoy. Silence cost chances. Allied doctrine bent to exploit the weakness. Western approaches orders drilling escorts to treat every HFK-DF spike as an immediate maneuvering cue. Alter course down the bearing. Bring Type 271 or SG radar to bear and light the sea the instant metal appeared. Hunt replaced hope. HFDI-DF bearing green 30. Strength 4Y altering to intercept. Became a practical catechism on bridges where wet pencils scratched quick lines and helms, arms with booms braced against spray. Procedure found urgency. Ultra decrypts from Bletchley Park gave the Admiralty the chessboard. Pack formations, rendezvous beacons, transit lanes, while Huff-Duff gave escorts the move of the moment, a bearing to a voice that could not help but speak. Intelligence met immediacy. The Germans layered counters. B-dienst intercepts, new radar detectors like Naxos against Ahunti-Symetra sets. Snorkels late in the war, but each answer arrived slower than Allied innovation spread across fleets. Delay bled advantage. By early 1943, the mid-ocean air gap was shrinking under VLR patrols, escort groups improved under hard taskmasters, and convoys began to sail with at least one shipborne HFK-DF set on a mast like a quiet crown above the bridge. The gap closed with metal. U-boat crews still believed the gale, and the night would hide them, that a burst of 30 seconds to report a convoy could not be pinned in a sea of static, that a low black hole between combers was more rumour than target. Belief hardened into habit. Escort reports disagreed. HF-DF contact, bearing red 15, strength increasing. Pip on 111 volana's radar. A rhythm that turned once, proud ambushes into frantic dives, as flares painted conning towers and hedgehog patterns hissed into black water. Evidence altered faith. D-Nits would later list the instruments of reversal, air cover, centimetric radar, escort carriers, and the very effective HF-DF on convoy escorts that made even short signals perilous, and his staff logs tally May 1943 as a month when losses spiked beyond endurance. Black May had a cause. The context was simple, and it mattered the weapon that knit the pack also betrayed it. And in a war of miles and minutes the side that could hear in the storm could steer in the dark. And once bearings drew X on wet charts, invisibility was only a story the sea told its sons. HF-DF on an escort's mast looked almost modest. 4 slim vertical elements in a square, an adcock array feeding a goniometer that steadied a needle while the hull rolled and the wind hunted the rigging. It listened like a predator. The set worked in the U-boat's language, the high-frequency bands around 3 to 30 manats, where contact reports leapt by skywave to France, and it produced bearings within seconds, often within a few degrees if the operator caught the transmission clean. Speed made certainty. An RN-type H.4 could strip out skywave confusion by measuring phase differences between the aerials, the loopless geometry killing the old Y80 degree ambiguity that had haunted earlier direction finders. Clarity killed doubt. Operators trained to ride gain. Hunt the null and call a bearing before the message ended, while a yeoman scratched the thin line across a damp chart, and the helm answered with a turn that sent green water blasting down the deck. Hearing became motion. 2 escorts meant 2 lines, and crossed bearings put a small, cruel X on the sea within minutes. Add a shore station's bearing, and the X tightened to a place where searchlights, 10-play C-membered radar, and star shells could give a shape to the whisper. Geometry became a net. On the U-boat, the radio was a weapon and a weakness, telefunken transmitters throwing short. Coded bursts, Kerr signal, through an Enigma key that BDU could read but the enemy could not. Security favoured speed. A standard contact report might last under 20 seconds, a shadowing update shorter still, and disciplined skippers spoke as if holding breath. The message clipped, the antenna wire thrumming in the wet wind. Discipline felt safe. The type the eye was built for such nights, roughly 67 meters of welded steel, with 2-man diesels for 17 knots on the surface and 2 electric motors for 7 submerged, a range measured in 500 nautical miles at 10 knots, and a conning tower as narrow as a blade. Stealth wore steel. She could dive in 30 seconds when alarm sounded, planes biting and ballast whistling, then creep at 3 knots under batteries while the hull ticked faintly as it settled. Silence had a craft. Early in the war, surface invisibility after dusk was doctrine. Attack surfaced. Fire from within the columns. Trust the dark and the low silhouette while ASDIve stared beneath, and long wave radar could be heard by METOX before it saw. Night felt like an ally, but centimetric radar, Type 271 on British escorts, SG on American, arrived with cavity magnetrons humming in tight metal hoods, able to pluck a conning tower pip from heavy seas at a few thousand yards, rain or not. Electrons ended illusions. HF-DF stitched that radar into a hunt sequence, bearing from a voice. Course altered. Radar slewed to the angle. Star shell up. Then crash, dive versus hedgehog and depth charges depending on who won the seconds. A chain replaced chance. HF-DF bearing red 20, strength 4, altering course to intercept 271, contact 800 yards. Runs a typical escort report from spring 1943. Each segment a cog that locked the next until water fell on black steel like falling stone. Procedure became fate. German counters multiplied. METOX for metric radar, then Naxos for 100.7 emissions, tighter radio discipline, and plans for courier burst transmitters that would compress a report into a blink. But necessity kept boats talking long enough for bearings to bite. Need broke secrecy. BDU's doctrine prized coordination. A lone hunter might kill a straggler, but a pack broke a convoy, and that demanded contact reports, shadowing and attack orders that stitched miles of sea into a single, exposed circuit. Connectivity charged a toll. Allied doctrine hardened at Western approaches. Treat every HF-DF spike as intent. Turn down the bearing. Bring the radar and the ready star shell to bear, and push support groups. Fast, spare escorts not tied to convoy lanes. To the sound of the signal. Aggression wrote orders. At sea the machines formed a personality of their own. Hedgehog ahead. Throwers spitting 24 contact. Fused bombs in a tight oval. ASDI's Type 144 and Kine holding a contact at slow speed, and, when conditions allowed, walkers. Creeping attack. With one ship steady on sonar, and a second sliding in silent for the throw. Technique learned patience. The U-boat's counters grew subtler. Snorkels to run diesels submerged, periscope, depth charging in poor weather, and radio silence until attack. But by the time snorkels spread, aircraft and escorts had already closed the mid-ocean gap, and Huff-Duff had taught bridges to hear intent. Late answers met early problems. Air power folded into the circuit VLR liberators with ASV-MK. A radar could sweep ahead of convoys, while shore HF-DF stations plotted pack beacons and relayed bearings that sent sea and sky hunting the same shadow. Domains overlapped. Signal strength rising, bearings steady, became the phrase that told a bridge the U-boat was closer than comfort. The pencil line now a corridor more than a guess, the next minute's a test of training under sleet and spray. Confidence tightened. Even decryption sat alongside the dials. Ultra read the pattern, the where and when of the wolves, while HF-DF heard the breath, the here and now of a boat that had to speak. Intelligence found immediacy. In the end, the machine's character was not a single box or stick of aerials, but a choreography. Radio bearings, centimetric pips, flares, sonar hum, and the drum of depth charges. That turned the U-boat's greatest strength, coordination by radio, into a soft spot. The net learned to hear, and once escorts learned that a 10 Second whisper could be drawn as a line on a wet chart, and sailed like a promise. The Atlantic's night stopped being a cloak and became an instrument. Listening wrote the hunt. May 5 to 6, 1943, Mid-Atlantic. Convoy ONS-5 clawed west in a sleet-torn gale while the escorts of B-7 Group, HMS Duncan, Vedette, Sunflower, Snowflake, Lucistrife, and Pink, rode green water to their gunwales. The ocean sounded like iron. U-boats shadowed surfaced in the dark, black backs rising between combers, whispering contact reports to BDU and calling the pack to feed as they had for years. Confidence came easy. On HMS Vedette's bridge, a wet-fingered yeoman pinned a chart, while the HFA-DF operator steadied the goniometer needle, his headphones crackling on a narrow cut of high frequency. Listening became a blade. HGF-DGF bearing green 30. Strength 4, he called, and another escort 2 columns Aston answered with its own line. The 2 bearings crossing in a small X that the navigator tapped with a nail-bitten finger. The trap found a shape. A German Captain lieutenant cupped a gloved hand around his throat mic and spat a clipped Kerr signal. Sighted convoy, course, speed, will shadow, trusting 20 seconds of speech to vanish into storm and static. Habit felt safe. Type 271 centimetric radar answered coldly on a British set. A hard pip blooming at 600 yards just off the HFA-DF line, and a signalman shoved a star shell into the flare pistol with numb hands. Electrons made certainty. 180 HDF-DDF contact, altered course to intercept, 271 contact 3200 YDs, illuminating shell fired. A watch officer wrote into the night order book, ink blurring where spray struck the page. Evidence kept pace. The flare rose. A white parachute sun that turned spray to milk and painted a conning tower in soft blue on the heave. Men hunched. Rails gleamed. A number half seen and then lost. Invisibility snapped. "Alarm! Torchen!" the U-boat commander bellowed. The diving klaxon braying as boots hammered the steel ladder, and the sea took the bridge in a cold fist. Panic ran downhill. Diesels died and electric motors wound up in a thin, urgent whine, bowplanes bit, and the Atlantic closed over the tower with a gulp that swallowed the last smear of star light. Darkness grabbed back. On the British bridge the voice stayed flat. "Keep her on 3-5, Hedgehog ready." While the helmsman braced his knees, and the forward Hedgehog launcher swung to spit 4 contact bombs in an oval just ahead of the guest track. The ship became a clock. Dropped pattern at 0231, no explosions. The ASDIC team noted, then whispered. Contact regained. Bearing fine on the bow. Range closing. The pinger metronome under the storm as the creeping attack took shape. Patience learned teeth. Vedette and Sunflower worked the geometry, one ship holding sonar, the other sliding in silent at 5 knots to lay a depth charge pattern set shallow for a boat that had only just slipped under. Choreography replaced chance. Depth charges. Fire! The pattern rolled off the rails and racks, thumps counting down the wake. Then the sea heaved and lifted, the smell of cordite cutting through diesel and salt while a brown slick ran with cork and shattered wood. Silence broke open. From a log later filed ashore, Audran 238A oil and wreckage cited, ASDIC contact lost, area searched, no survivors. Finality fit in one line. Elsewhere along the same convoy the same script played. HF-DF spikes turning ships like weather vanes, star shells opening the sky, 100 cm'd pips fixing the last yards, and crash dives met by hedgehog ovals and shallow set charges. Repetition wore down nerve. Enemy now attacking in great force. Support requested. Went one convoy voice earlier that night, but by dawn B7 reported multiple U-boats, destroyed or driven off. The wolf pack's edges torn as escorts hunted bearings, instead of waiting to be stalked. Roles reversed. A corvette coxswain wrote in his tiny notebook, glove prints smearing the pencil, HGF DDIF again. 3 lines. Turned and went. Fired star. He went down. Charges. Oil. Memory condensed to action. Above the gale. A liberator of Coastal Command called in a sighting and bracketed a diving wake with depth bombs. And the support group that DU-NITS dreaded arrived by wireless nav to join the kill, roving free of convoy lanes to maul any transmitter that dared speak. The net tightened wide. In BDU's war diary for late May, after ONS-5 and its sister battles had run their course, the line turned from iron to ash. Die Augenblicklich hohen Verlust machen ein vor Berghend Einstellung der U-Boot. Offensive im Nordatlantic notwendig. Shock reached the staff. DO-NITS pulled his boats back from the North Atlantic routes, the measure of defeat written in numbers and in silence, because the radio that once called wolves had taught the hunters exactly where to aim. Arrogance had found its limit. Green water still boomed on plates, and the escorts still rolled until pots and men slid together. But the bearings on damp charts had become decisions, and the night no longer belonged to the shadow. The moment turned on a whisper. Black May forced a reckoning, and DO-NITS pulled his boats back to rethink tactics while BDU orders hardened radio discipline to razor edges. Shorter Krasignal, pre-arranged codes, and transmissions timed to squalls. Fear entered procedure. A handful of U-flak. Boats sailed with extra 20 mm and 37 mm guns, baiting aircraft to fight it out on the surface and win back the night by fire. The idea died quickly. RAF and USN crews answered with Huff-Duff of CRM's ASVMK. I-FI and SG radar that saw through weather, lay lights for the final reveal, and gunnery runs that raked decks before a gun crew could even swing a shield. Fire met radar. German radar detectors evolved. Mitox to hear meter band sets. Then Fumbi-7 Naxos to sniff at Handley CRMU. Yet detection ranges were short and conditions fickle. And once a boat spoke on an HF, its position bled into bearings the escorts could sail like a rule. Counters came late. Funk discipline streng einhalten. BDU warned. Strict radio discipline, while the staff flagged. Funk Peilung. As a rising peril in the KTB, acknowledging that Allied HFDF on escorts made even brief signals dangerous. The ether felt hostile. The U-boat arm struck back with new teeth. The T5 Zonka acoustic torpedo. The Allies called it G-Mate. Homed on propeller noise and punished escorts that charged straight in. Ambush shifted targets. Action reports from autumn 1943 rid with a chill. Torpedo reported. No wake. Turned outward. Speed 12. Foxer streamed. Torpedo past Aston. Terse lines describing the birth of a countermeasure. A towed noisemaker that drew the G-Nant off. Ingenuity dulled fear. Foxer, FXR saved ships but brought trade-offs. Self, noise that blinded ASDI, and a speed penalty in heavy seas, forcing escorts to choreograph attacks and decoys while keeping the bearings from Huff-Duff in mind like a drumbeat. Complexity raised stakes. On the surface of doctrine. Captain, Johnny. Walker's support group 2 drilled the creeping attack. One ship holding sonar contact slow and quiet while a second advanced in hush to lay a precise pattern. Patience learned to kill. Logs from his group and others grew repetitive and ruthless. HEF-DF bearing steady. Creeping attack executed. Hedgehog fired. One explosion. Oil. Wreckage. A cadence that piled on nerves as much as hulls. Repetition bred dread. Farther west. Hunter-killer groups coalesced around escort carriers. USS Bogue Card, Corps, and later Guadalcanal, whose CICs fused HFG-DF bearings with radar plots to vector Avengers and Wildcats onto transmitters that had just finished speaking. Integration closed distance. Chafe DF fix. Vector Arrow 90 30 miles. ASV contact. Attack. An Avenger crew scrawled into a debrief. The chain crisp from whisper to splash as depth bombs bracketed a swirl where a periscope winked and vanished. Speed became lethal. The Bay of Biscay, once a highway for homebound boats, turned into a gauntlet under coastal command, Liberators and Sunderlands stitching patrol lines while shore Huff-Duff stations threw long bearings to choke the exits. Transit became terror. Air observation continuous, radar warnings intermittent, crew exhausted. A U-boat KTB noted late in 1943. Words dry as ship's biscuit, but heavy with the grind of days spent submerged and nights spent sprinting on batteries. Fatigue set in. Snorkels offered a late refuge, letting diesels breathe at periscope, depth and radios transmit without a full surfacing, but they slowed boats to a crawl, crowded the conning tower with condensation and fumes, and left mastheads to betray them in a chop. Safety came shackled. Even with snorkels, coordination still demanded words, and words on HF still drew lines on wet charts, where escorts could meet them with star shells, centimetric pips, and the oval splash of hedgehog bombs. Necessity betrayed stealth. Dion Nitz admitted in 10 years and 20 days that Allied HF-GDF played a significant part, alongside air cover and radar in breaking the offensive, and his boats felt it in the narrowing of choices: transmit and be hunted, or stay silent and hunt alone. Strategy lost freedom. On convoy bridges the routine hardened into reflex. HGIF-DF bearing green 15, strength increasing, alter course, 271 set, hedgehog ready, and green water exploded over bows that knew the way without thinking. Habit carried edge. Milchka supply submarines, Types IV tankers, became priority targets once radio plots betrayed rendezvous points, and their loss starved packs of fuel and torpedoes far from Biscay. Support bled out. Statistics codified the feeling: more than 40 U-boats lost in May 1943, over 200 in the year, and the attrition stayed high into 1944, even as tactics shifted and new gear arrived. Numbers crushed bravado. German crews carried on with a stark courage, attacking convoys, firing G8s, sprinting under flags of spray, but their patrols lengthened in silence, and their returns shortened in head count, while mess decks at Lorient and State Nazar grew quieter between toasts. Confidence eroded. Allied escorts kept adding sets, refining drills, and layering air with sea until the convoy screen felt like a moving fortress of sensors and intent, each HFTDF spike turning the whole formation by a few degrees toward a hunted voice. Presence felt relentless. Between the brief call signs and the boiling wakes lay the new truth of the ocean war. The tool that made the pack strong forced the pack to speak, and the act of speaking pulled the hunters closer. Adaptation carried fear. Summer 1944, western approaches to the Channel. The weather lay in low layers, and the barometer soaked, while convoys for Neptune filed south in columns, under a roof of aircraft, and a ring of escorts, bristling with sensors. The ocean felt guarded. On frigates and destroyers, HFEDF needles twitched at the edge of hearing and turned ships by degrees. Plotting rooms chalked quick X's, and centimetric radars searched the angles like lighthouses you could not see. Direction became dominance. Western Approaches Command named the barrier Operation Cork, a moving wall of escorts and patrol aircraft from Land's End to the Irish Sea, meant to bottle U-boats before they could reach the invasion lanes. A straitjacket closed on Biscay. HFDF bearing green 12, strength 3, altering course, reads one escort's night log off Ushant in early June. A tidy line written while boots skidded on spray, slick planking and a star shell waited in a cold fist. Procedure wore steel. Hunter, killer groups roamed outside the convoys, escort carriers knitting sea and sky into one net. CICs fused shore bearings with shipboard Huff-Duff and vector lines to launch Avengers into clouds, where a transmitter had just fallen silent. Integration erased gaps. Vector Lero 85 40 miles ASV contact attack. An Avenger crew scrawled after a dusk run, then added simply, oil debris. No survivors. The quiet cadence of men who had learned to find a whisper and end it. Clarity turned lethal. Captain Walker's second support group became a legend with sloops Starling, Wild Goose, Kite, Wren, and Woodpecker carving wakes through winter gales, executing creeping attacks that read like surgery, one hull holding contact at slow speed, the other sliding in to lay the pattern. Patience killed surely. In early 1944, the group claimed 6 U-boats in a single patrol, the Aztec plots curled like Nautilus shells in the logs, and the post-action signals carried the same cool rhythm. Contact maintained hedgehog fired. One explosion, wreckage sighted. Repetition crushed nerve. New tools deepened the edge. 147B, Sword. Sonar held contact during the run-in, and the 3-barreled squid mortar threw a heavy pattern ahead. Depth fused to burst where calculations said a hull must be. Math found hulls. Huff-Duff steadied the opening move, and escorts no longer groped. They turned down a bearing, lit the sea, and set the chain in motion with the practiced calm of men who trusted their instruments more than the dark. Confidence replaced luck. In the Bay of Biscay, Coastal Command stretched long patrol lines of Sunderlands, Wellingtons, and Liberators, while shore HF-DF stations threw bearings like spears into exits boats had once sprinted through at dusk. Transit became peril. Funk Pylong, feigned Richtet Nach Unseren Meldungen, a wary KTB note warned, radio direction finding, the enemy steers by our reports, and BDU ordered transmissions shorter still, rendezvous relocated, and snorkels raised whenever the sea allowed. Awareness tasted bitter, yet even the snorkel campaign made the night smaller. Boats crept at a few knots, men coughed in diesel fumes. Lookouts stared at a masthead that could betray them in a swell, while escorts patrolled at 20 knots toward any spike Huff-Duff offered. Stealth slowed to a crawl. On June 4, 1944, Task Group 20.3 from USS Guadalcanal ran a perfect arc from bearings to boarding, trapping U-505 off West Africa after radio plots and radar pips stitched a path to her. A boarding party leapt across and dragged the first captured U-boat since 1815 into daylight. Hearing turned to seizure. The capture yielded Enigma books and technology, but the symbolism cut deeper. A wolf snatched alive from its ocean, its belief in invisibility stripped as casually as a tarpaulin. Myth met a deck. Over the channel in the days after D-Day, U-boats probed under aircraft and guns and found little but hard water. A few torpedoes found ships, but most attacks ended in flares, hedgehog splashes, and oil that slicked the wakes of outbound escorts. Opportunity shrank to moments. Convoys ploughed on, Liberty ships, LSTs, troop ships, while escort groups treated every HFG-DF spike as a turn of the wheel, and traffic to the beaches became a schedule more than a gamble. Logistics turned invulnerable. HF-DF steady, bearing red 20, strength rising. An officer of the watch recorded west of Cherbourg, and below his calm script the depth charge party checked pistols and fuses, waiting for the voice that would cue the attack. Calm masked anticipation. German crews adapted with courage. G-ments fired at charging screws, decoys towed, silent hours stretched into grey days. But each patrol bled strength, and each return to Lorient or St. Nazaire found fewer faces in the mess. Endurance hollowed. By late 1944, the numbers told the weather. Merchant losses fell while U-boat sinkings climbed, and the average submerged day grew longer than the night on the surface as boats hid from a network that heard better than it saw. Statistics carried weight. Huff-Duff was not the only blade, but it was the first cut, turning a 10-second whisper into a ship's heading, a heading into a radar pip, a pip into a flare into a dive alarm, and a dive alarm into hedgehog thumps that silenced the sea. Sequence became certainty. In the white churn behind the escorts, Oil slicks and splintered cork drifted under gulls, and the plotting boards in warm, bright CICs added another grease pencil cross to a day that would not make the papers. Domination stayed quiet. The Germans had trusted the night, the gale, and the range to make them ghosts. The Allies learned to hear the ghost breathe, and to follow the breath through storm and spray. The sea belonged to them. Shipyards from Belfast to Bay City hammered keels into the tide, slipways greased for corvettes, frigates, destroyer escorts, and small carriers that would knit the Atlantic into a guarded road. Scale drowned doubt. Britain turned out Flower-class corvettes and River-class frigates by the hundreds in yards that smelled of hot rivets and wet timber, while the United States launched over 500 destroyer escorts and more than 100 escort carriers to roam on hunter-killer duty. Quantity became reach. On benches under shaded lamps, Marconi and standard telephones and cables assembled FH3 and FH.4 HFDF sets, 4 slim aerials feeding goniometers, whose needles held steady when decks did not. Listening was manufactured. Training pipelines matched the metal. Royal Navy signal schools like HMS Mercury are drilling operators to ride gain, catch the null, and call a bearing before a 20-second Kursignal died. Skill was a product. The cavity magnetron, the British gift of the Tizard mission, left Cambridge for MIT's Rad Lab and Raytheon's lines, and thousands of Hun-Bowlint CMED sets returned to sea in Type 271 lanterns and American SG domes that painted conning towers through rain. Electrons were stamped like coins. Depth charge casings rolled from presses and filled with Torpex, while hedgehog spigots multiplied on foredecks, 24 65-pound bombs in tight ovals that waited for a single contact to detonate. Precision found mass. In Western approaches, WATU, Captain Gilbert Roberts and a cadre of Wrens with chalk and model ships. War gamed the convoy fight until, turn down the bearing, and creeping attack, became ritual more than experiment. Doctrine had a workshop. Shore wire stations spread like quiet sentries from Iceland to the Clyde to Newfoundland and Freetown, their HFDF arrays throwing long lines into plotting rooms where clerks pinned bearings that moved escorts far beyond what eyes could see. Distance bent to wire. HFIDF bearing green 20, strength 4, alter course, became not a thought but a reflex, and the logbooks show the litany alongside engine revolutions and barometer drops, as if it had always been there. Habit hardened. Escort carriers closed the gap between hearing and striking. Bogue, attacker, and Casablanca-class decks, turning bearings into vectors for Avengers and Swordfish that could find a transmitter minutes after it spoke. Air made immediacy lethal. Liberty ships 700 strong ploughed cargo into Britain, fuel, explosives, food, while Coastal Command took Behe-24 Liberators off bomber lines and gave them ASV-K, N radar, lay lights, and depth bombs to patrol where convoys could not. Logistics fed tactics. On the German side, yards at Kiel, Bremen, and Hamburg accelerated U-boat assembly even as crews thinned, and BDU demanded shorter signals and fewer words to keep the wolves coordinated without drawing knives of bearing. Output met fragility. On Serverlust and Erfurnen signed Anna Setzlich. A staff line admitted, the loss of experienced men is irreplaceable, while training syllabi shrank under fuel shortages, and patrols sailed with boys who had more courage than ours. Human capital bled. Courier high-speed burst transmitters were planned, snorkels ordered, and new electroboot. Type checks eye holes promised. Yet the calendar moved faster than the fixes as Huff-Duff and 100-pi CMUM radar were bolted to every new escort that slid into water. Innovation outran remedy, fuel fuses magnetrons, and miles of cable crossed oceans in Liberty, holds to feed escort groups that could sail on bearings alone and arrive with weapons already plotted. Supply became foresight. After action signals read like invoices, HFDF fix obtained radar contact, star shell, hedgehog, oil and wreckage. A cold chain that converted factory time and classroom chalk into a black slick on grey seas. Process made outcome. American shipyards could weld a destroyer escort in weeks, and British yards could turn out a corvette between tides, and every launch meant another mast crowned with the quiet square of an Adcock array. Each hull added an ear, in plotting huts and CSEs. Operators learned to love the needle more than the horizon, and the line it drew on a damp chart began as a whisper in the ether, and ended as a course and a kill. Confidence wore headphones. This was not luck or weather. It was an industrial symphony that mated a magnetron to a bearing to a radar pip, a pip to a star shell, and a star shell to a pattern of bombs that could be read from a procurement ledger. War became a system. And when the system ran at full tempo, yards, schools, stations, decks, the ocean's oldest sanctuary could not hide a voice for even 20 seconds without calling the hunters closer. An avalanche of steel learned to listen. After May 1943, the Atlantic changed colour in the minds of men who crossed it. Convoys sailing with a new steadiness, while escorts treated whispers on the ether like buoys you could steer toward in the dark. Relief had a tone. Winston Churchill wrote what every merchant captain had lived to his marrow. The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. Fear had an author. By Black May, the peril bent. 40-plus U-boats were lost, and BDU's war diary set down the reluctant sentence. Die Augenblicklich Hohand verlust machen ein vor, Bergehende Einstellung der U-Boot. Offensive im Nordatlantic notwendig. Defiance found a limit. Crew logs kept the rhythm that broke the myth. HFRDF contact, altered course, 271 pip obtained, star shell fired. Oil sighted. Lines written without flourish by men who had learned to trust a needle more than a horizon. Method beat legend. Carl Du Nitz conceded later that the Allied shipborne HFDF was very effective, a sober phrase in 10 years and 20 days that sits beside his longer grief over air cover, magnetrons, and support groups that turned a night surface attack into a death sentence. Admission weighed heavy. For U-boat men, the memory clung in particulars. Battery acid and damp wool, the taste of stale air under the snorkel, the shock of a flare turning the sea to milk, and the conning tower to a stage. All triggered by a transmission they had believed too brief to matter. Trust turned brittle. An escorts operator remembered the same instant from the other side. The headphones, hush snapped by a hard spike at 10 mph. The goniometer's needle settling like a decision, and the helmsman's boots bracing for the turn before the order finished. Hearing became deed. After the last patrol reports were filed, and the keels went quiet, the artifacts took their places where visitors could find them. The square Adcock aerials on preserved masts, the brushed metal hoods of centimetric sets under museum lights, and the blackle painted hull of U-505 hauled ashore in Chicago with her radios, Enigma gear, and the silence around them. History kept its hardware. At Bletchley Park, huts tell of Y stations as much as ciphers. Operators catching skywave scraps from Scarborough to the Clyde and feeding bearings to plots that made the ocean smaller one whisper at a time. Listening earned a chapel. Walk the decks of a preserved frigate or cruiser, and the story comes back with the weather. HFFDF on the mast, AST-IC in the shack, hedgehog on the foredeck, and a copy of the watch bill weather line, HFADF bearing. Alter course, hides in plain sight between engine revolutions and barometer drops. War became routine. The legacy ran forward as well as back, into the Cold War's rind, elephant cages. Vast circularly disposed antenna arrays that learned to triangulate voices across continents, and into every bridge and operations room, where direction finding lives as a quiet, permanent skill. A trick became a craft. Doctrine carried the lesson deep coordination is power, and every network hums with seams. If your strength demands speech, expect the enemy to learn your grammar, and if your hope is invisibility, remember the flare that floats down like a verdict. Pride met physics. The numbers bear out the feeling. Merchant sinkings fell through 1943, while U-boat losses climbed, and by 1944 the mid-ocean gap had closed under a canopy of aircraft and a ring of escorts that treated each transmission as a prelude, not a mystery. Trends grew teeth. Dean Nitz's boats adapted with courage. G-men slung at screws, snorkels rigged. Signals compressed to blinks. But the choice set narrowed until patrols were spent beneath instead of among the columns, and radio discipline felt less like craft and more like a cage. Necessity shrank freedom. The crews on both sides carried the weight, names etched on the wall at Satane, Nazaya, and in the quiet corners of messes in Greenock and Derry. Because even a perfect bearing still ended in cold water, deep explosions, an oil that smelled like burnt metal on grey swells. Mastery exacted a price. In the end, the ocean did not keep secrets from the prepared. The escort that heard well enough to steer, the aircraft that saw through rain, and the convoy that trusted the plot over the dark rewrote a campaign that had once been terror in the singular. Silence lost its edge. That is why a box of coils and 4 slender aerials stand taller in memory than their dimensions suggest, and why veterans speak softly of the night, when the sky went white and a black tower stood revealed, because a man somewhere spoke for 20 seconds too long. A whisper became a map. Germans trusted their submarines were invisible until Huff-Duff led the Allies right to them.